I'm Martha, a 28-year-old massage therapist at a local hospital. My days usually involved routine treatments until Mrs. Rossi, a feisty retired woman with osteochondrosis, became my regular patient. She had a knack for prying into personal matters, which I usually navigated with a mix of professionalism and humor. One afternoon, as I was working on her stiff shoulders, Mrs. Rossi's voice cut through the room's tranquility. "Martha, dear, you have such magical hands. Tell me, what does a job like this pay?" I smiled, continuing my motions. "It's around $4,000 a month, Mrs. Rossi." She clucked her tongue in a mix of surprise and disappointment. "Only $4,000? I thought such a skill would fetch more." I shrugged, keeping the conversation light. "Well, it's enough for me. I enjoy the work more than anything." Changing gears, she suddenly said, "You know who you should meet? My son, Antonio. He's the owner of that Italian restaurant downtown. A real catch, if I may say so." I hesitated, recalling the few times I saw Antonio. He was quite charming and easy on the eyes. "I don't know, Mrs. Rossi. I'm quite busy with work." "Oh, nonsense," she exclaimed. "A young, attractive woman like you shouldn't be alone. Let me arrange something." Before I could protest, she had already made up her mind. True to her word, she set us up on a date at his restaurant. Antonio was more than I remembered, charming, with a warm smile and eyes that sparkled with humor. Our conversation flowed effortlessly, filled with laughter and shared interests. Weeks turned into months, and our casual dates grew into a serious relationship. One evening, as we walked along the river, Antonio stopped and looked into my eyes. "Martha, I've never met anyone like you. Will you marry me?" His proposal took me by surprise, but it felt right. "Yes, Antonio, I will." Our wedding was a small affair but full of love and joy. Afterward, Antonio suggested, "Why don't we move in with my mom? Her house is big, and we could save some money for our future." The idea seemed practical, and I agreed. Initially, life in the Rossi household was harmonious. I helped with chores, and we both contributed to the family expenses. Little did I know that this new chapter of my life would soon take a challenging turn. Living in the Rossi household started off as an agreeable arrangement, but a few months into our marriage, I began to notice a shift in responsibilities. It was gradual at first, but soon, the burden of household chores fell almost entirely on my shoulders. One weary evening, after spending the whole day relieving tense muscles and soothing aching joints at the hospital, I came home to a scene of chaos: dirty dishes piled high, laundry scattered, and the living room looking like it had been hit by a small tornado. Exhausted, I found Antonio sprawled on the sofa, engrossed in a football game. "Antonio, the house is a mess. Can you help me clean up?" I asked, trying to hide my frustration. He glanced around, seemingly oblivious. "Oh, it's not that bad, Martha. I had a rough day at the restaurant, lots of issues to deal with." I started picking up, feeling the day's fatigue weigh me down. "But you've been home for a while now, and I've just got back. It's only fair we both contribute." He let out a noncommittal grunt, eyes glued to the screen. "You're better at this stuff than I am. I'd just get in the way." This pattern continued, growing more defined with each passing day. I found myself doing all the cooking, cleaning, and managing the home, while Antonio's contributions became increasingly scarce. A few days later, I decided to have a serious talk with him. After dinner, which I had prepared, I broached the topic. "Antonio, we need to discuss the housework. It's becoming overwhelming for me to handle everything alone." He looked up from his phone, seemingly annoyed. "What's there to discuss, Martha? You're great at managing the house. I'm busy with the restaurant." His dismissive attitude stung. "But we're a team, Antonio. It's not just about being good at something. We should share these responsibilities." He sighed, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Look, I'll try to help out more, but you know my work is demanding. I'm running a whole business, not just giving massages." I bit back a sharp retort, feeling belittled and misunderstood. It's not about comparing jobs, Antonio. It's about supporting each other. As the days turned into weeks, the situation didn't improve. Antonio's promises to help more around the house remained unfulfilled. I found myself spending my few free hours doing household chores, feeling more like a housekeeper than his wife. One evening, as I collapsed on the couch after a long day, the reality of my situation hit me hard. The balance in our marriage had shifted dangerously, leaving me drained and undervalued. I realized that something needed to change, but I wasn't sure how to make Antonio see it too. The day Luca and his family moved in marked the beginning of an entirely new, exhausting chapter in our lives. Antonio broke the news to me nonchalantly, as if it was a minor change. "Martha, Luca lost his job. They can't pay rent, so they'll stay with us for a while," he explained, while I was setting the table for dinner. I stopped in my tracks, the plates in my hands feeling heavier. "For how long, Antonio? Our house isn't that big, and I'm already stretched thin." He shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "Just for a bit, until Luca finds a new job. It's family, Martha. We can't turn them away." Their arrival turned our already bustling household upside down. Anna, Luca's wife, seemed more interested in her social media than in managing her children or helping around the house. Their 3 kids, aged between 3 and 8, were little bundles of chaotic energy, leaving a trail of mess wherever they went. One afternoon, after stepping on a toy car for the umpteenth time, I approached Anna, who was scrolling through her phone. "Anna, could you please keep an eye on the kids? The house is turning into a war zone." She looked up, annoyance flickering in her eyes. "Martha, I'm busy with my own stuff. You don't have kids, you wouldn't understand." "But Anna, the mess and noise are overwhelming. I work too, and it's becoming impossible to manage," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She scoffed. "Well, I guess you just need to get better at multitasking, then." I walked away, feeling a mixture of anger and helplessness. When I brought it up with Antonio, hoping for some support, his response was disheartening. "Babe, they're family. We need to be there for them," he said, not looking up from the TV. "But what about us, our home? It's turning into chaos," I protested. He waved his hand dismissively. "It's not permanent. Besides, you handle things so well, Martha. You're great at this." Weeks turned into months with no sign of improvement. Luca spent his days on the computer, claiming to be job hunting, while the kids ran around unchecked. Anna rarely lifted a finger to help, leaving me to deal with the aftermath of their daily tornado. I started to dread coming home. My once peaceful haven was now a source of endless stress. Each day, I walked into a house that no longer felt like mine, catering to a family that barely acknowledged my exhaustion. The burden of cooking, cleaning, and maintaining order fell entirely on me. Despite my pleas for help or even just a little consideration, I was met with the same responses. "You're so good at this, Martha," or "it's just for a little longer." I lay awake at night, wondering how a situation meant to be temporary had become my new, overwhelming reality. I felt trapped, undervalued, and utterly alone in a house full of people. The funny thing is that I invested my entire salary in their family every month, all of $4,000. And they took it for granted. The tension in the house had been building like a pressure cooker, and it finally exploded one hectic evening. I came home to the usual chaos and mess, utterly exhausted from my workday. The sight of the unkempt house was the last straw. "Antonio!" I yelled, finding him lounging on the couch with a beer in hand. "This house is a disaster. I'm busting my back at work and I come home to this mess every day." Antonio looked up, irritation flashing in his eyes. "Oh, cut the drama, Martha. It's just a bit messy. You're acting like it's the end of the world." I couldn't contain my frustration. "A bit messy? Look around. It's like a pigsty and I'm the only one cleaning it up." That's when he lost it. He stood up abruptly, towering over me. "Lazy? You call this lazy? I work my ass off at the restaurant while you just rub people's backs. And now you whine about a few dishes." His harsh words felt like a slap in the face. "That's not fair, Antonio. I'm not your maid. This is supposed to be our home, not just mine to clean." Before I could say more, Mrs. Rossi chimed in, her voice dripping with disdain. "Oh, please, Martha. You're just a freeloader here, living in my house, using our things. And you have the nerve to complain." I was taken aback by her vicious tone. "A freeloader? Mrs. Rossi, I contribute to this house, I work hard too." She scoffed. "Work hard? Ha! A real woman takes care of her home and family. You're just sloppy and ungrateful." Their words echoed in my head, each one a stinging affirmation of how little they valued me. I stood there, shaking with a mix of anger, shock, and hurt. Antonio didn't let up. "You should be thankful, Martha. You have a roof over your head because of us. Maybe if you managed your time better, the house wouldn't be such a mess." I felt a surge of defiance. "I am not your servant, Antonio. I am your wife, and I deserve respect." But it was like talking to a brick wall. They had their minds set, seeing me as nothing more than an accessory to their home. Lying in bed that night, I realized that this wasn't a home, it was a prison. And I was trapped with people who saw my efforts as trivial and my presence as a nuisance. It was a sobering, painful realization that I was in a battle I was losing. The day Antonio announced he wanted a divorce felt like a surreal nightmare. It happened during one of our rare family dinners, where the tension was already thick enough to cut with a knife. I was passing the salad when Antonio cleared his throat. "Everyone, I have something to say," he announced, his voice eerily calm. "I want a divorce, Martha." I froze, the bowl in my hands almost slipping. "What? Antonio, what are you talking about?" His gaze was cold, devoid of the warmth I once knew. "I've met someone else, Martha. She's better for me." The room went silent. Even Mrs. Rossi looked shocked, but not for the reasons I hoped. "How much does she earn?" she blurted out, her priorities crystal clear. $8,000 a month, Antonio replied proudly, as if he'd won some prize. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. "You're leaving me for money?" He shrugged, the man I married nowhere in sight. "It's not just about the money, Martha. She understands me, unlike you." I was struggling to process everything. "And you think this is okay? To drop this bomb in front of everyone?" Mrs. Rossi piped up, her voice sharp. "Well, it's about time he found someone worthy. Someone who can actually take care of him." The sting of her words was overshadowed by the utter betrayal I felt from Antonio. He slid the divorce papers across the table. "Just sign these, Martha. Let's end this amicably." My hands trembled as I took the pen. I felt numb, the reality of the situation sinking in. Amicably? After everything I've done for this family? Antonio's expression was cold, detached. "It's for the best, Martha. You'll see." With a heavy heart and a sense of unreal detachment, I signed the papers. The room remained silent, the only sound being the scratching of the pen on paper. As I stood up, the weight of the situation finally hit me. "I hope she's worth it, Antonio. I really do," I said, my voice laced with a relief I couldn't hide. I packed my things that night, the silence of the house echoing the hollowness I felt inside. Antonio and his family watched, their faces a mix of surprise and confusion at my calm demeanor. Little did they know, inside, I was even rejoicing at the thought of being free from this toxic environment. I closed the door behind me, leaving behind a life that was no longer mine. The night air felt crisp and refreshing, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere I had just escaped. As I walked away, I realized this was not an end, but a new beginning. Moving into my rented apartment was like stepping into a new world. I took all the furniture and fancy appliances I had bought, leaving behind nothing but empty spaces in Antonio's family home. It caused quite the uproar. I still remember the day Mrs. Rossi and Anna confronted me as I was loading the last of my things into the moving truck. You can't just take all this stuff. It belongs in the house. Mrs. Rossi shouted, her face red with anger. I turned to face her, feeling a surge of defiance. Actually, I bought all of this with my own money. It's mine, and I'm taking it with me. Anna chimed in, her tone dripping with disdain. You're such a selfish brat, Martha. You think you can just walk away and take everything? I shrugged, not letting their words get to me. Call it what you want, but I'm done being your maid and your family's cash cow. I'm starting over. They were fuming as I drove away, but I felt an immense sense of relief, like I had shed a heavy burden. Settling into my new place, I reveled in the peace and quiet. It was small, but it was mine. The day I received the job offer from the prestigious medical center was the icing on the cake. The salary was nearly double what I was making before. I remember calling Sarah to share the news. Guess what? I got a job offer from that famous medical center. It's a big leap in my career, and the pay is amazing. Sarah's excitement mirrored mine. Martha, that's fantastic. You totally deserve this. You're going to kill it. The conversation was a stark contrast to the ones I had in Antonio's house. Here was a friend who believed in me and celebrated my achievements, not someone who saw me as just a means to an end. My first day at the new job was exhilarating. I was greeted with respect. Mr. Johnson, the center's director, welcomed me personally. Martha, we're thrilled to have you on board. Your expertise is going to be a great asset to our team, he said with a genuine smile. I couldn't help but beam with pride. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I'm excited to be here and contribute to the center. Leaving the chaos of Antonio's family home and stepping into this new role was empowering. It felt like I had finally taken control of my life, steering it in the direction I wanted. The days of being undervalued and overburdened were behind me. Now, I was recognized for my worth, both professionally and personally. That night, as I sat in my quiet living room, sipping a cup of tea, I felt a profound sense of peace. The struggles and hardships had led me to this moment, and I was grateful for the journey. For the first time in a long while, I was genuinely excited about what the future held. It was a regular evening in my new life when I heard a forceful knock on my door. I opened it to find my ex-mother-in-law, Mrs. Rossi, standing there with an expression that reeked of desperation and frustration. "What do you want, Mrs. Rossi?" I asked, not hiding my annoyance. She barged in, her voice laced with urgency. "Martha, you need to come back. Antonio's restaurant is tanking. We're drowning in debt." I couldn't help but snort. "Come back? After the way you all treated me? You've got some nerve." She glared at me. "You're part of this family. It's your responsibility to help us out." I crossed my arms, feeling a surge of defiance. "My only responsibility is to myself. I'm not your family's ATM, Mrs. Rossi." She was seething. "You ungrateful wench. You think you're too good for us now, huh? Sitting pretty in your fancy apartment?" I shook my head, amused by her audacity. "I'm not ungrateful. I'm just done being used. What happened to that woman Antonio left me for?" Mrs. Rossi's face twisted in displeasure. "That gold digger? She left him as soon as the money troubles started. Shows what she was really after." I burst into laughter, the irony too rich to ignore. Well, looks like karma really does come around. Her eyes narrowed. "You think this is funny? We're struggling here, Martha." I leaned against the door frame, my resolve firm. "Not my circus, not my monkeys anymore, Mrs. Rossi. I've moved on. You should too." She huffed, her anger palpable. "You'll regret this, Martha. When you're all alone and miserable, you'll wish you'd helped." I smiled, the sense of freedom filling me with confidence. "I doubt that. Goodbye, Mrs. Rossi, and don't come back." She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. As I locked it, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. That chapter of my life was closed for good. I was finally free from the toxic grasp of a family that never truly valued me. My life was my own now, and I intended to live it on my terms. Life after the divorce and the last encounter with Mrs. Rossi felt like a breath of fresh air. I was thriving in my new job and enjoying my newfound independence. One day, while enjoying a coffee break at the wellness center, my colleague Mike dropped by. "Hey, Martha, I heard about your run-in with the ex-mother-in-law. You okay?" Mike asked, concern in his eyes. I chuckled, shaking my head. "More than okay, Mike. It's like a bad sitcom, you know? I'm just glad it's over." Mike smiled. "You've got some guts, Martha. Most people wouldn't have handled it as well as you did." I sipped my coffee, feeling a sense of pride. "I guess I just reached my limit, Mike. No more drama for me." The conversation shifted to work, and as I talked with Mike, I realized how much my life had improved. I was no longer weighed down by the negativity and manipulation of my former family. Later that week, I caught up with Sarah over dinner. She had been my steadfast supporter through all the ups and downs. "You look great, Martha. Really, like a weight's been lifted off your shoulders," Sarah observed as we sat in the cozy restaurant. I smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thanks, Sarah. It's been a journey, but I'm finally at a place where I feel happy and in control." Sarah raised her glass. "To new beginnings and to a friend who's shown what strength really is." I clinked my glass with hers. "To new beginnings and to friends who stand by you through thick and thin." The evening was filled with laughter and positive conversations, a stark contrast to the tense and uncomfortable dinners at my former in-laws. As I lay in bed that night, I reflected on the changes in my life. I had faced adversity, but it had led to growth and new opportunities. I had learned my worth and vowed never to let anyone treat me as less than I deserved. The following morning, I received a text from Antonio. It was short and seemed filled with regret. "I'm sorry for everything, Martha. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." I stared at the message for a long moment. Forgiving Antonio wasn't about absolving him of his mistakes, it was about freeing myself from any lingering bitterness. I typed a response, my heart light and free. "Antonio, I've moved on. I forgive you, but more for my peace than yours. Take care." Sending the text felt like closing a chapter. I was no longer bound by the past, and the future looked bright. I had come out of this ordeal stronger and more resilient. As I prepared for work, I felt a sense of excitement about the possibilities that lay ahead. My journey had taught me about resilience, self-worth, and the power of moving forward. I was ready for whatever life had in store for me, and I knew that no matter what, I had the strength to face it head-on.
"Hey, take care of this, will you?" Daniel, my husband of 8 years, barely looked at me as he flung his leather bag across the room, its contents scattering like fallen leaves in autumn. The bag landed with a thud, papers spilling out onto the hardwood floor. I sighed. A familiar sense of resignation washing over me. Lately, this was how our conversations usually began, or rather his orders. I bent down, gathering the strewn papers, when a particular document caught my eye. It was stark, official-looking, and utterly unexpected, a divorce paper. My heart sank, then, oddly, a wave of relief followed. The kind of relief you feel when a long-dreaded inevitability finally stares you in the face. Daniel's part was already filled in. He had made his decision, without so much as a conversation. The realization stung, but it was also liberating in a strange way. Without a second thought, I found myself reaching for a pen. My hand trembled slightly as I filled in my details. "Sarah Thompson," I wrote, my name etching the end of an era. I paused, looking at the man I once thought I knew. Daniel was lounging on the sofa, mindlessly flipping through TV channels. The man who had once been my partner, my confidant, had become a stranger. "Sarah, what's for dinner?" His voice, devoid of warmth, pulled me back to the present. I turned to him, the divorce paper still in my hand. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. Daniel finally looked at me, his eyes narrowing. "What about?" "This." I held up the paper. His expression changed from indifference to surprise, and then to something I couldn't quite decipher. You found that, huh? He finally said, a smirk playing on his lips. Yes, I did, and I've made my decision, I replied, my own voice laced with a firm resolve I didn't know I had. The room filled with a heavy silence, one that spoke volumes more than our brief exchange of words. It was the silence of a chapter closing, of a new beginning taking shape amidst the ruins of the old. As I stood there, holding the symbol of our failed marriage, I realized this was just the beginning. The journey ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in years, I felt a sense of control over my own destiny. The silence lingered in the air long after Daniel had retreated to our bedroom, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The stillness of the room was a stark contrast to the turmoil inside me. I sat down on the couch, the divorce papers still clutched in my hand, and my mind began to drift back to the beginning, to the days when everything seemed so promising. We had met at a networking event for professionals. Daniel, with his charismatic smile and confident demeanor, had seemed like a breath of fresh air. Sarah Thompson, right? I've heard a lot about your marketing skills, he had said, extending a hand that I shook, unaware of how significantly this moment would alter my life. Our conversation flowed effortlessly, and soon we were meeting for coffee, then dinner, and before I knew it, we were inseparable. Daniel was attentive, kind, always knowing what to say to make me laugh. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have found someone who understood me so well. As I sat on the couch, lost in the memories of our early days, a stark realization hit me. Those days were long gone, replaced by a cold indifference that had crept into our marriage so subtly that I hadn't noticed until it was too late. I thought back to the little things that started to change after our wedding. The way Daniel's sweet messages became less frequent, how our conversations turned from deep and engaging to functional and brief. It was a gradual shift, one that didn't alarm me at first. I had convinced myself that this was just what happened in marriages over time. Comfort, I told myself, often replaced passion. But comfort didn't mean disrespect. It didn't mean coming home to a husband who barely acknowledged your existence unless he needed something. The man I had fallen in love with, who had promised to be my partner in life, had slowly morphed into someone I no longer recognized. The sound of a car outside snapped me back to reality. I glanced at the clock. It was late. I had been sitting there, lost in thought, for hours. The house was quiet, Daniel likely asleep, uncaring of the storm he had unwittingly unleashed in me. I stood up, my resolve strengthening. The Sarah who walked into this room a few hours ago was not the same Sarah now. The discovery of the divorce papers had opened my eyes to a truth I had been avoiding. Our marriage was over, and it was time for me to reclaim my life. I placed the divorce papers on the table, a symbolic gesture of my readiness to face whatever came next. Tomorrow, I would start the process of untangling my life from Daniel's. It would be challenging, but I knew I had to do it, not just for my own sake, but for the woman I once was and the woman I needed to become again. As I headed to bed, a sense of determination filled me. The road ahead would be filled with obstacles, but I was ready to face them head-on. This was not just the end of my marriage, but the beginning of a new chapter in my life. The morning light spilled into the bedroom, casting a warm glow on the walls. It was a new day, but the weight of my decision still rested heavily on my shoulders. As I made my way to the kitchen, the house felt unusually quiet, almost as if it were holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. Daniel was already up, sitting at the dining table, his eyes fixated on the morning paper. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, a stark reminder of the distance that had grown between us. I busied myself with making coffee, the familiar routine providing a semblance of normalcy in the chaos of my emotions. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen, a comforting presence in an otherwise tense atmosphere. Sarah, Daniel's voice broke the silence, his tone surprisingly soft. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. Yes? We need to talk about this, he said, gesturing towards the divorce papers that lay between us. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Yes, we do. The conversation that followed was a far cry from the heated arguments we had become accustomed to. Instead, it was a candid, albeit painful, acknowledgement of where we had ended up. Daniel spoke of his frustrations, his sense of being trapped in a life he hadn't envisioned. I listened, not with the intent to argue, but to understand. As he spoke, I couldn't help but wonder how we had missed the signs. The late nights at the office, the weekends spent apart, the growing silences at dinner, they were all telltale signs of a marriage unraveling at the seams. "I just feel like we're living separate lives under the same roof," Daniel finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I feel the same," I replied, the truth of my words hitting me with full force. We were two strangers sharing a life that no longer existed. The conversation shifted to practicalities: the house, our finances, the inevitable legal proceedings. It was a surreal experience, discussing the end of our marriage with a calmness that but belied the turmoil within. As the morning turned into afternoon, we reached a mutual understanding. The divorce was inevitable, but we would handle it amicably, respecting the love that once was. After Daniel left the house, presumably to meet with a lawyer, I found myself alone with my thoughts. The finality of our conversation had left me drained, yet there was an underlying sense of relief. The veil of pretense had been lifted, and in its place was a clarity that had been missing for years. I wandered into the living room, my eyes falling on the paintings that adorned the walls. They were remnants of a passion I had long forgotten, my love for digital art. In the early years of our marriage, I would spend hours creating vibrant landscapes and abstract designs, losing myself in the colors and shapes. But as my marriage began to crumble, so did my desire to create. Standing there, surrounded by my own art, a spark ignited within me. It was a reminder of who I was before, a woman with dreams, passions, and a zest for life. A woman who deserved more than the shadows of a loveless marriage. In that moment, I made a decision. I would not only reclaim my life, but also my passion. I would start painting again, not just to fill the void left by my broken marriage, but to rediscover the part of me that I had lost along the way. With renewed purpose, I turned on my computer and opened my digital art software, a familiar welcome screen greeting me. It felt like coming home. As I began to sketch, the lines and colors flowing effortlessly from my fingertips, a sense of peace enveloped me. It was the peace of a woman who had faced her fears, who had taken the first step towards a new beginning. Days turned into weeks as I navigated the murky waters of divorce proceedings. Despite the amicability we had agreed upon, each meeting with Daniel felt like retracing steps in a dance we no longer understood. However, amidst this turmoil, I found solace in my rediscovered passion for digital art. The more I immersed myself in my creations, the more I felt the pieces of my old self falling back into place. One evening, as I sat in front of my computer, lost in a complex design, a series of pings from my phone broke my concentration. It was Ethan, our son. "Mom, can we have dinner this weekend?" "I have some news," his message read. Ethan had been our one constant source of joy. His light-hearted nature and youthful optimism had often been the glue that held us together in our darker days. I replied immediately, agreeing to the dinner. Saturday arrived, and I found myself sitting across from Ethan at our favorite Italian restaurant. He had the same sparkling eyes and easy smile that had always reminded me of Daniel in our happier times. "So, what's this news you have?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Ethan's smile widened. "I'm getting engaged," he announced, his excitement contagious. I felt a burst of happiness for him, mixed with a tinge of sadness for the family life we could no longer give him. "That's wonderful, Ethan. Tell me about her." As Ethan shared stories about his fiancée, his plans for the future, I couldn't help but reflect on the cycle of life. Here was my son, on the cusp of building his own life, his own family, while mine was unraveling. The dinner continued with light-hearted chatter, but my mind kept drifting back to Daniel. I wondered if he knew about Ethan's engagement, if it mattered to him at all. Driving home later that evening, a sense of loneliness enveloped me. The house that once echoed with the laughter and arguments of a family now stood silent, a monument to a life that once was. In the days that followed, as I worked on my art, I found myself reflecting on the bonds that had once tied us as a family. Ethan had always been our anchor, but even he couldn't prevent the drifting apart of two people who had lost their way. My thoughts were often interrupted by memories of Daniel's recent interactions with Julia, his coworker. I remembered the late-night calls, the weekend meetings that he insisted were for work. I had trusted him, never questioning his loyalty. But now doubt crept in, its insidious tendrils wrapping around my heart. Was there more to Daniel's relationship with Julia than just work? The thought nagged at me, an itch that I couldn't quite reach. I remembered the casual touches, the shared laughs, the way they seemed to exist in a world of their own during company functions. I shook my head, trying to rid myself of these thoughts. It didn't matter now. Daniel and I were on separate paths, our journey together, nothing but a memory. As I continued to delve into my art, I realized it was more than just a hobby. It was my lifeline, pulling me away from the edge of despair. With each stroke of my digital brush, I felt a sense of purpose, a reminder that there was life beyond the ruins of a failed marriage. The weeks leading up to Ethan's engagement party were a blur of activity and mixed emotions. While I busied myself with preparations, a part of me dreaded the event. It would be the first family gathering since Daniel and I had decided to divorce, and the thought of facing him in a room full of people filled me with unease. The day of the party arrived, and the atmosphere was festive, filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Ethan and his fiancée, a charming young woman named Anna, were the picture of happiness. Watching them, a sense of melancholy washed over me. They were beginning their journey together, full of hopes and dreams, while mine with Daniel was coming to an end. As guests mingled, I caught sight of Daniel across the room. Our eyes met briefly, 1,000 words passing between us in that silent exchange. He looked older, more tired, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of the old affection. But it was quickly replaced by the stark reality of our situation. The evening progressed, and I found myself in conversation with some of Ethan's friends. Their youthful enthusiasm was infectious, and for a while I forgot the complexities of my own life. It was then that I noticed Daniel talking to Julia in a corner of the room. They were laughing, their heads close together in a way that was intimately familiar. The sight struck a nerve, and a surge of emotions welled up inside me. The doubts that had been simmering in my mind came to the forefront. The more I observed them, the clearer it became. There was something between them. Something more than just professional camaraderie. I felt a mix of anger and sadness, the realization of Daniel's betrayal hitting me like a wave. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself standing outside, taking in the cool night air. The sounds of the party faded into the background, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Ethan joined me, his expression softening as he saw my troubled face. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, concern etched in his voice. I forced a smile. "Yes, I'm fine, just a little tired, that's all." Ethan looked at me, his eyes searching for the truth. "Mom, you know you can talk to me about anything, right?" I nodded, grateful for his support. "I know, honey, and I will. Just not tonight." He hugged me, a gesture of comfort that brought tears to my eyes. As he went back inside, I stood there, feeling the weight of the evening. The drive home was a reflection of my thoughts, long and winding. The sight of Daniel and Julia together had confirmed my suspicions, and with that confirmation came a sense of closure. I realized that it was time to let go, not just of Daniel, but of the life we had built together. As I lay in bed that night, the events of the evening replayed in my mind. The laughter, the music, and most of all, Daniel and Julia. It was the end of a chapter, but as with all endings, there was also the promise of a new beginning. In the weeks following Ethan's engagement party, I found myself in a state of introspection. The revelation of Daniel's relationship with Julia, though painful, had given me a sense of closure. It was as if a final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, allowing me to see the complete picture of our failed marriage. With this newfound clarity, I threw myself into my art with a vigor I hadn't felt in years. My digital canvases became a kaleidoscope of emotions, each piece reflecting a different facet of my journey: pain, hope, resilience. It was therapeutic, a way to channel my feelings into something tangible and beautiful. Meanwhile, the divorce proceedings were moving along, albeit slowly. Daniel and I had settled into a routine of distant yet cordial interactions, a far cry from the turbulent exchanges of our earlier meetings. It was a strange kind of dance, two people moving around each other, careful not to step on old wounds. One afternoon, as I sat working on a particularly intricate design, my phone rang. It was the lawyer, informing me that the divorce was finalized. The words hit me with an unexpected force. Even though I had been preparing for this moment, the finality of it left me feeling oddly hollow. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The young, hopeful woman who had married Daniel, full of dreams and aspirations, was now a more mature, seasoned version of herself. I had lost some of my naivety, but in its place I had gained strength and a deeper understanding of myself. One evening, as I sat gazing at the latest piece I had created, a vibrant depiction of a phoenix rising from the ashes, Ethan called. "Mom, I wanted to talk to you about something," he said, his voice serious. We met at a small cafe the next day. Ethan's expression was a mix of excitement and apprehension. "Anna and I were talking, and we'd like you to move in with us after we get married," he blurted out. The offer took me by surprise. "Ethan, I can't intrude on your new life like that," I protested, touched by his concern but wary of imposing. "It's not an intrusion, Mom. We want you there. Anna loves the idea, and I don't want you to be alone." His words warmed my heart. Here was my son, embarking on a new chapter in his life, yet still looking out for me. It was a testament to the bond we shared, one that had only grown stronger through the trials of the past year. After much discussion, I agreed. It was a new beginning, not just for Ethan and Anna, but for me as well. A chance to be part of their life, to share in their joys and challenges, while also giving myself the space to continue my own journey. As I packed up my belongings over the next few weeks, I felt a sense of bittersweet nostalgia. Each item, each piece of art, was a reminder of a life lived, of lessons learned, and of the resilience that had carried me through. Moving day arrived, and as I stepped into Ethan and Anna's home, I felt a sense of belonging. It was a new environment, but one that was filled with love and warmth. Ethan and Anna had gone out of their way to make me feel welcome, setting up a small studio for me to continue my art. In the days that followed, I found a new rhythm to my life. I spent my mornings working on my art, exploring new techniques and styles. In the evenings, I would join Ethan and Anna for dinner, sharing stories and laughter. It was during one of these dinners that Ethan turned to me, a serious look in his eyes. "Mom, how are you really doing? After everything with Dad, I mean." I took a moment to reflect, then smiled. "I'm doing okay, Ethan. Better than okay, actually. I've found a new purpose in my art, and being here with you and Anna has given me a sense of family that I thought I had lost." Ethan smiled, relief evident in his eyes. "I'm glad, Mom. You deserve to be happy." As we continued our dinner chatting about everything and nothing, I realized that this was what healing looked like. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic change, but a gradual rebuilding of oneself, piece by piece. And as I looked around the table, at the faces of my son and his fiancée, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be. In this new beginning, I had found not just a place to live, but a home. Living with Ethan and Anna brought a sense of harmony and companionship that I hadn't realized I was missing. Their youthful energy and love for each other were infectious, and I found myself looking forward to the simple pleasures of our daily life together. One afternoon, as I was setting up my art supplies in the small studio Ethan had arranged for me, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from a number I didn't recognize. Hesitantly, I opened it, and to my surprise, it was from Julia, Daniel's coworker. "Sarah, can we meet? There's something I need to tell you about Daniel," the message read. My heart skipped a beat. What could Julia possibly have to say about Daniel now after all this time? Curiosity piqued. I agreed to meet her at a nearby cafe the next day. Sitting across from Julia, I noticed the nervousness in her eyes. She fidgeted with her coffee cup before speaking. "Sarah, I owe you an apology," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Daniel and we had an affair. It started before your divorce. I didn't realize the extent of the damage we were causing." Her confession, though not entirely unexpected, still stung. I had suspected their relationship, but hearing it confirmed brought back a flood of emotions. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. Julia sighed, a look of genuine remorse on her face. "I ended things with Daniel. It was wrong, and I regret it deeply. I just thought you deserved to know the truth." I sat there, processing her words. Part of me wanted to be angry, to lash out at the woman who had been part of my marriage's downfall, But another part, the part that had found peace and moved on, simply felt pity. "Julia, what's done is done," I said finally. "I appreciate you telling me, but I've moved on. I hope you can too." Leaving the cafe, I felt a weight lifted off my shoulders. Julia's confession had closed the final chapter on a part of my life that was now firmly in the past. Over the next few months, my life settled into a comfortable routine. My art was flourishing, with several pieces being featured in local exhibitions. Ethan and Anna's wedding was fast approaching, and the excitement in the house was palpable. As I watched Ethan and Anna together, so full of love and hope for the future, I couldn't help but reflect on my own journey. The pain of the past had given way to a quiet strength, a resilience I hadn't known I possessed. The wedding day arrived, a beautiful ceremony filled with laughter, tears, and an overwhelming sense of joy. Watching Ethan and Anna exchange their vows, I felt an immense pride for the man my son had become. After the wedding, as guests mingled and danced, I found myself standing alone for a moment, taking it all in. It was then that I saw Daniel, standing a short distance away, watching me. Our eyes met, and for a brief moment, time stood still. There was so much I wanted to say, so many questions I wanted to ask. But as I looked at him, I realized that none of it mattered anymore. Daniel nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had passed between us. Then, turning away, he disappeared into the crowd. As I rejoined the celebration, a sense of peace settled over me. My journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but it had led me here, to this moment of contentment and hope. Life, I realized, was a tapestry of experiences, each thread woven with its own story. Some were dark, others bright, but all were essential in creating the larger picture. And as I danced with Ethan, my heart full of love and gratitude, I knew that my tapestry was still being woven, each day adding a new and beautiful thread to the story of my life.